My interest today is less to deal with actual cases of the seizure of Jewish-owned art during World War II, but the lack of depiction of this as a subject in American cinema. Many of you have seen the film The Monuments Men, a somewhat fictionalized account of the Allied attempt to track down art stolen from the Nazis. Less well known is a film dealing with the same subject, The Train, from 1964. Both films were adapted from incidents in the book Le Fond de l'Arc by Rose Antonia Maria Vaillant. The characters played by Cate Blanchett in The Monuments Men and Suzanne Flon in The Train were based on Vaillant, who worked during the occupation at the Jeu de Paume in Paris when it housed art seized by the Nazis. Pretending not to understand German, Vaillant was able to gather and pass information to the French resistance regarding trains carrying stolen artwork to Germany. As Paris was ready to fall to the Allies in August 1944, Vaillant conveyed news about the last shipment of stolen art so that the train carrying it could be stopped. Whereas The Monuments Men covers a longer period of art recovery at the war's end, The Train was loosely based on Vaillant's account of this last art train. Once you see The Train, I think that you will agree that the true story of this train is in some ways more interesting and fantastic than the heavily fictionalized one we are about to see on screen. The last shipment from the Jeu de Paume was primarily modern art seized from French Jews. In particular, the shipment included 400 of the 2,000 pieces of art taken by the Nazis from the collection of art dealer Paul Rosenberg. Rosenberg was a major figure in the art world between the wars, with galleries in New York, London, and Paris. He represented leading painters, including Picasso and Matisse. The French resistance, notified that the shipment was about to be taken to Germany, got the cooperation of French railway employees and managed to stall the train through bureaucratic means. Later, Free French forces, who had no knowledge of what the train contained, dynamited the railroad tracks, preventing the train from advancing. By an amazing coincidence, the Free French unit was led by Alexander Rosenberg, Paul Rosenberg's son. Alexander entered the captured train and was surprised to recognize artworks that had hung in his family home before the occupation. It would be nice to say that this story ended with the restitution of all the Rosenberg artworks, but this was not to be. Since the war's end, the family tried to recover much of their property. For example, a Norwegian museum held a Matisse taken from the Rosenbergs during the occupation. Under legal and moral pressure, the painting finally was returned to the Rosenberg family just a few months ago. Another Matisse belonging to the Rosenbergs is in the Gurlitt collection in Germany and has not yet been returned to the family. Many works are missing altogether. The issue of stolen art is still with us. So how does The Train depict this theft? In the film, the issue of confiscation from Jews is avoided. Early in the film, when the Nazi officer von Waldheim comments on a Gauguin canvas, curator Mademoiselle Villard, the character based on Vaillant, says that it was from the Plouvet collection. That is the only suggestion of private ownership in the entire film, and one that replaces Jewish names like Rosenberg with one that does not hint at Jewish ownership. But this doesn't mean that ownership and confiscation are not issues in the movie. Indeed, they are central to the action. As Mademoiselle Villard points out when trying to persuade skeptical railroad workers to stop the art train, the paintings belong to France. This beauty, this vision of life born out of France, we hold it in trust for everyone. Later, Labiche, the leader of the attempt to stop the train, comments, "You know what is on the train," he says. "Art, the national heritage, the pride of France." We might ask ourselves, why is it that the issue of private restitution is suppressed within a discourse of national heritage in this film. There are a number of reasons, some due to the particularities of the film's production, to political events in the United States, and to the depiction of Jews in Hollywood films at the time. The Train, produced by a company owned by Burt Lancaster, was to be directed by Arthur Penn, later famous for Bonnie and Clyde, Little Big Man, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller. The film was conceived as a meditation on the value of art compared to the value of human life. The artwork didn't even get onto the train until after the first 90 pages of the script, more than halfway through the picture. However, things were to change. Lancaster was a prominent liberal in Hollywood, and a couple of years before The Train, took a substantial cut in his usual salary to play a Nazi judge in Judgment at Nuremberg, a film that was released at the same time as the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. So it would be fair to say that Lancaster had some awareness of Holocaust-related issues. But Lancaster's film just prior to the production of The Train was The Leopard. Widely regarded as a classic today, this film, dealing with issues around the Risorgimento in Italy, was a bomb on its first release. Fearing the effect on his career, Lancaster was determined to turn The Train into a crowd-pleasing action picture. Arthur Penn was fired, two screenwriters who specialized in westerns were brought in, and direction was turned over to John Frankenheimer. Frankenheimer discarded most of the script and added much material not in the book. So the film changed from a meditation on the comparative values of life and art to one more focused on the heroic efforts of the resistance to save France's cultural heritage. Burt Lancaster's career management problem is not enough to explain why the issue of the theft of art from Jews has been excised from the story. The Train was made near the end of the post-World War II blacklist period in Hollywood, when investigations into alleged communist activities by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, usually referred to as HUAC, made many people in the film industry unemployable. Hollywood was a primary focus of the investigation of the committee, and Jews as a group were strongly identified with communism by committee members. Prominent Hollywood Jews were called before the committee, and more were unable to find employment due to suspicion that they were Reds. For example, the best-known persecution by the House Committee on Un-American Activities was of a group known as the Hollywood 10. These were 10 screenwriters and directors accused of leftist activity. They were imprisoned and blacklisted for refusing to cooperate with the committee. 6 of the 10 were Jews, and 3 of the remaining 4 had been associated with films dealing with anti-Semitism or anti-fascism. Although there's no doubt that the Hollywood 10 had been active on the left, to be a Jew was to be suspect. Arthur Miller, whose play The Crucible in 1953 was a thinly veiled commentary on HUAC's activities, wrote on the effect HUAC had on his work at the time, observing, "I gave up on the Jews as literary material because I was afraid that even an innocent allusion to an individual Jew would be inflamed by the atmosphere, ignited by the hatred I was suddenly aware of, and my love would be twisted into a weapon of persecution against the Jews." Around 1960, the blacklist was being challenged by a few filmmakers, most notably Otto Preminger and Stanley Kubrick, both of whom hired blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo to work on Exodus and Spartacus. But most filmmakers still kept their heads down and avoided actions that would attract the attention of HUAC. Many of the Jews in Hollywood, singled out by the committee, were also prominent collectors of modern art, such as William Goetz, head of 20th Century Fox during World War II, and Edward G. Robinson, who regularly lent works from his collection to major museums in the United States. These and other people in the art world were viewed with political suspicion. Indeed, in 1951, the Los Angeles City Council passed a resolution condemning modern art as communist propaganda and banned its public display. It was also a period of hostility to intellectuals who were viewed as left-leaning eggheads and therefore suspicious. Liberal university faculty were dismissed, others forced to sign loyalty oaths. Cultural institutions were particularly singled out to prove their loyalty. For example, the Museum of Modern Art in New York returned a collection of socially conscious films donated by Warner Brothers 2 decades earlier. In the train, the most prominent intellectual is not the owner of the art, nor the curator who wants the train stopped, but rather the Nazi villain. I think that given the climate of the time, sympathetically portraying a wealthy Jewish intellectual would have been problematic. It was far less contentious to have a Nazi arguing the case for the ownership rights of the connoisseur at the film's end. Not to say that Hollywood films showed Jews in a negative light. Beginning in the immediate post-war period, a handful of films were made dealing with Jews. 2 that come to mind are Gentleman's Agreement, 1947, about institutionalized anti-Semitism, or Crossfire, also 1947, about the racist murder of a Jew. But there were risks to dealing with such topics. Many creative staff of both films were subpoenaed to appear before HUAC right after the film's releases, and subsequently blacklisted or jailed. So there were risks to portraying Jews in social problem films. If we think of films depicting Jews made in the few years preceding The Train, a pattern emerges. In 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments depicts the struggle of the Israelites against their enslavement. But in the film's prologue, DeMille implies that this is a metaphor for the struggle between the free world and communism. 1959's Ben-Hur shows Jesus' intervention on behalf of the persecuted Jewish members of the Hur family, who recognized Jesus' divinity at the film's conclusion. In the same year, The Diary of Anne Frank, with the Frank family victimized by the Nazis. Then there is Exodus in 1960, with tragic endings for most of the refugees who traveled to freedom in the Holy Land. Judgment at Nuremberg showed documentary footage of concentration camp victims for the first time in an American feature film. Shortly after The Train was The Pawnbroker, whose death camp survivor, protagonist, lives a life of misery. Frankenheimer himself would work in this genre when he directed The Fixer in 1968, loosely based on the Mendel Baylis trial in Tsarist Russia. While there are some exceptions to this portrayal of Jews, in the few years around The Train's release, it appears that Hollywood liked Jews, but liked them as victims. In terms of the cultural discourse of this period, the idea that French citizens were risking their lives to return a collection of modern art to a wealthy and intellectual Jewish family was likely to be received with little enthusiasm. So the true story of The Train, which continues today in the Rosenberg's family struggles to recover their property, is depicted instead as a struggle by France to regain its cultural patrimony. Thank you.